This is a spare bedroom, not a professional studio. Or is it? Because on YouTube, the line between the two has basically disappeared. You can record in a room like this, or hire a full production team and create in a studio environment. And both videos still end up on the same feed, chasing the same attention. Which brings up a bigger question. How do independent creators still succeed on the platform now that YouTube has grown up? Because the old promise was simple: broadcast yourself. And the new reality is a lot messier than that. Which is exactly why I had to talk with Francis. He writes about the creator middle class and talks with the people building real businesses online. His take is quite blunt.
YouTube is not dying as a platform, but I think that you're referring to a sort of indie maker, indie creator culture that we have reached the peak of.
And like me, he also hosts a podcast, Talking with Creators. Except he does it for a company while I do it out of a spare bedroom. So let's look at the reality behind the content to find out if independent creators can still make it work. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with you because you and I, we are both at least playing the same sport. We're both creating content around and for creators in sort of the middle. I call it the messy middle. You say creator middle class. And it's all based around conversations with creators and people in the creator space. I feel like this year more than ever, we really see everything converging because everything is TV, everything is on every device, and it really, there's no differentiation anymore. If you are creating out of a spare bedroom or you have a huge studio, it all ends up on the same platforms.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
The novelty of there being an individual who is using their phone to make stuff and distributing it to a platform and receiving millions of views, like it's not really novel anymore.
The kind of question that's in the back of my mind right now is the creator, the individual creator kind of dying out? Are they also disappearing with the word creator? Or do you think the platforms just enable anybody at all times?
I don't think it's that the individual creator is dying out. I think that it's that companies are learning how to work with creators. So it's less that the individual creator is dying out. It's more that this class of creator that is part of a company or is working with a company on a contract, like that is more coming to the fore. And there will always be, as long as these platforms exist in the way they do, which is to say anybody can publish. And if the work is packaged really well, and if it's quality, and if it hits in the algorithm, then they could get a bunch of attention, right? As long as the platforms work like that, there will be new individuals coming in. But more what we're talking about here is that companies are learning how to go into these talent pools and find people to work with on a longer term. So yeah, it's not that the solo creator is dying. It's that companies and creators are learning how to work together in a more formal manner.
It's almost like people wanted to become TV hosts, and then those people could just become YouTubers, and now they kind of can become hosts for brands.
This is like a sort of unfounded hot take, but I think that more people want to work with companies than we might think, right? I like being part of a company. I like having teammates. I like having the resources and security of a company. But the teammate aspect is like so crucial. I love playing team sports, right? I'm not somebody who wants to go out there and just like lone wolf it, do it on my own. That's not very appealing to me. I'm a social being, right? I love other people, working with other people. And I think that more people are like that than are like total gung-ho solopreneur types. I think that like a lot of people would take some pay cut. A lot of creators might take some pay cut for the security and comfort of working for a company. But my hot take is that people want to work with companies or with media companies, with other types of companies. People want to be part of a team. You can do things as part of a team that you can't do solo. And you can do things solo that you can't do as part of a team. But I think there's more you can do with part of a team. This is just my bias
Yeah.
as well.
I mean, I'm gonna be a little bit vulnerable here, but like in some ways, I definitely envy your position versus mine, right? Because you do have the backing of a company, you have people to take things from you. Like, I'm the producer, editor, host, marketing manager, whatever job title you want to give me, I'm all of them, right?
Yeah.
And when I first started writing business plans for the grants and stuff I've gotten, um, the key risk in what I do is that, if I'm sick for a day, that's just, we're done
Everything
here.
flows through you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
everything flows through me. I had a really good start into the year with the content, and then we hit April and I was full of ambition. But the reality is that I just had to work on the business. I had to lay some ground structure to make the rest of the year smoother. And so, yep, there's no content in April. That's just the way it is. And like, I see the difference because
Yeah.
I see your channel and I see a few other channels that kind of started around the same time. And the difference it makes of being just there every single week, being dependable versus, I work in seasons. There's a
Yeah.
video when I'm ready.
Well, there's some, I mean, I envy that sometimes too, but that's more of just that maybe it would have been beneficial to set up Career Spotlight in a season format. But I mean, I was sick for like 2 weeks. I got better about a week ago, and it was really hard to write the newsletter.
I think what we both kind of obsess about, or what we both, I think, trying to figure out in these conversations is how do creators still succeed despite everything working against them? Because it might from the outside seem more achievable than becoming a Hollywood actor, but once you get into like the detail of it, the reality of it, becoming a household name creator or becoming even a creator that makes a living from it is way harder than it seems from the outset. So I'm kind of curious to get your perspective on like what is it that differentiates those people that quote unquote made it.
They treat the business side really seriously and aren't as romantic about the production side, right? So my parents are farmers, small produce farm. It's like 8 acres. They've always worked very hard, right? Like 7 days a week for most of my life. They're like 72 and they still work at least a little bit every day. You gotta at least water the greenhouses on Sundays, right? And I asked my mom a few years back, why did you guys become farmers? Because to me, it's always kind of this romantic notion. The way they do it, it's like an organic farm. They're old hippies, right? There's a romance to it. And I asked my mom, why did you guys become farmers? And she said, well, we were having a baby and we needed to make a living, and that's what we were doing, and that's what we knew how to do. So it's what we did, right? It's very
Mm-hmm.
practical. And I think with being a creator, there's often, people are always, it's easy to impose this romance on it because it's creative work and we see art and artists in this romantic sense. But it's a trade like any other, like plumbing or welding. It's a trade, right? And maybe it's a little bit different, but the point of it, like, yes, there's the creative expression, but the point of it is to go out and make a living. And a bunch of the most successful, when I say a bunch, like 5 or 6 people I've interviewed of the 100 some, are they come from like consulting backgrounds, and then they go into the creator world and they're really good at building these systems. And it's not to say that they're not good at the creative work and that they're not producing, like they're producing, whether it's video, whatever, newsletters, they're producing content that people like, that there's a demand for, and then they're good at building a business around it. They're good at making content that lends itself really well to brand deals. They are good at setting up a production schedule and segmenting their time. So this is a production week, and then this week is like a business admin week, and we're not missing a day or whatever the cadence of content publishing it is, right? I've been going on for a while here, but like to sum it up, the people who are successful because they treat it like a business and are very serious about that as much as they're serious about the quality of the art that they're making.
I'm really glad you brought that up, the business side of things, because when I was asked this question in an interview a couple of weeks ago, the difference that I see between creators that make it and the creators that stay in the game versus the people that kind of just fade away is the ones that stay in the game constantly reinvent themselves. There's always an evolution to them, right? They don't just settle on what is working.
They don't stand still.
Yeah, they know when to pivot or at least how to experiment. But what you said about the business aspect, I think, is what makes me so personally frustrated with all the businesses coming into YouTube, because I see like they have the structure, they have the revenue, they have everything to make a great channel. But then I just get like frustrated. It's just like, yeah, but this is for the individual creator, like, you know, old man
Not
shouting.
anymore, baby. Like, that's why it's becoming harder, is because it used to be, you know, up until maybe even 10 years ago, less than that, it was pretty easy to start making stuff and you just put it out there every day and it gets picked up in the algorithm and you slowly get better at it. And brands want to work with you because there's, you know, you're putting out a really quality product and there's only so many. And now businesses are coming in and it's being operationalized, right? And like talking about these people who come from like a management consulting background, like they are so used to building these systems meant to exploit opportunities in some market or field, right? And so that eye is turned on the creator ecosystem, and that's just what it is, right? So it's becoming harder to compete because people who are better at building systems to compete for any of the money coming into a field like this, they are in here and they are taking advantage of those opportunities.
They changed the rules of the game.
Well, they didn't even change the rules of the game.
No.
They just came in and they learned the rules, and then they got really good at playing that game.
Yeah. Quick pause here, because this is exactly what I write about in the Orbit newsletter. Because the creator economy is getting more professional by the day, and independent creators need to understand more than just how to make good content. So in the newsletter, I share insights about the creator economy, traditional media structures, and the business side of it all to help you understand the game you're actually playing. The link for that is down below. Now back to the show. There is still some element of magic to it all, or at least some big element of uncertainty, because we've all seen the channels that have like 100 views, 150 views, 1,000,000 views, and then, you know, back down to 1,000 views or whatever, or people uploading for 3 years and just like, you know, flat viewership, but they still keep posting stuff, and another person who just like uploads 2 videos and just like viral famous, you know, from one week to the next. I mean, frustrating is the first reaction. I totally agree with you, because it's just like, but why? And I think there is a certain level of uncertainty that just makes it feel like a lottery, right? Where it's just like, you can put in 2 weeks of your time and make what you think is a banger video that hits all the right notes, and nobody cares about it. And you can just upload a rant or some personal emotional story, and that is what finally triggers the algorithm, as you know, the kids like to say.
And then you're incentivized to make more of those rants.
Like a friend of mine, good friend of mine, we started around the same time, you know, 2020, 21, and he's been a great filmmaker, great storyteller, really charming person, but nothing ever made really clicked with a big audience. And recently he had a very dramatic breakup, and that really triggered a lot of response. And I feel like he found his niche with that, right? Yeah. To talk about this. And it's just like, there is no content strategy that could have planned it that way. It was just like,
there is though.
I mean, if you from the get go say like, yeah, I'm a whatever relationship therapist and I want to get into that space, then yes, you can build a content strategy around that. But in his case, it was just like, I'm just gonna air my life story on Instagram right now, and that is what created connections with other people in a
Yeah.
on a much larger scale than it ever has before. He didn't change, his voice didn't change. It was just a specific
He
topic that
put
he
out
brought
something
up
that was more relatable and dramatic than previously, and that's what the market demanded.
as a consultant would say it. Yes.
No, but I mean that's it. Like if you if a person is engaged in making videos and publishing them to YouTube, or making short form videos, publishing them to Instagram, writing a newsletter, whatever, if they're engaged in it purely for their own creative satisfaction, that's great. But if they want to make money, then they have to acknowledge that they are creating a product, and that if there's nobody's giving it attention, then the product is not fit for the market, right? Like something about it is not correct, right? And if they want to make money, they have to adjust and find that product market fit, as they say in startups.
What is the product of creators? Because I went through a few incubator accelerator programs, and we always ask the question, what is your product? And I think for creators that isn't it can be very clear. I don't think it's very clear to people who get into the space, because it could be a product that you sell to your audience, but the content itself can be the product that is sold to advertisers.
The creator's product depends on what their business model is. If are they selling? Are they making money through YouTube AdSense? Are they making money through off-platform brand partnerships? Are they making money through paid subscriptions? Like that that defines what the product is. But let's say it's YouTube AdSense,
Mm-hmm.
right? So what they need to do is they need to get a lot of views. So they're making this mass market entertainment product. Or if it's working with off-platform advertisers and they have a small but specialized audience, then their product is that audience, right? And to create and package the product of this small, high value, specialized audience, they need to also create a product that draws that audience. We buy things in part because of how they make us feel about ourselves and the story they tell ourselves about who
Yeah.
we are, right? So I think it's good for creators to think about when you're building an audience. It's good to think about your product on that level. What does your product do for your audience? What does consuming your product make the audience feel about themselves? That's really important for any media business.
I mean, it's like nobody puts like a giant logo across his chest because it necessarily looks good. It signals some
Yeah,
kind of identity, right?
exactly. Yeah, and
It's
media consumption is like that too. It's just more private often.
yes, and increasingly so. One thing that's also been coming up more and more is like this like idea of the death of the monoculture, and that I don't know what you're watching. You have no idea what I'm watching,
Yeah.
and nobody's talking about anything anymore except I don't know, maybe once a year Severance comes out, or
The World Cup's coming up this summer.
will anybody care?
Yeah, it's the World Cup. Billions of people are going to watch it.
But these moments where everybody comes together and is rooting for something or caring about the same thing are becoming less and less.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is that something we should be worrying about? Is this something to care about, or is that just
I don't know the solution. I don't know what we can do about it, but I think it is worrisome because a lack of monoculture, another way of putting it, is like a lack of shared reality, shared reference points, or even those shared reference points are being filtered through really different ideological creators and filters, right? Like the news will be reported and we will consume it. We, being like people quite broadly, will consume it through our chosen channels, who might be creators who don't
mm,
report the news, but they interpret the news and provide opinions on the news, right? So like this is just one angle in, but that's not in one way, it's not good that there are so many more voices doing this and that traditional media has been kind of fragmented in this way, because it's good for people to have some consensus reality, right? And in other ways, there are aspects of it that are good, because when it is closer to a monoculture, there tend to be valuable perspectives that are not being included. So I fall on the side of like, it is bad that culture is increasingly fragmented, because consensus reality is good for the health of society. But I don't know what can be done to change that. I think it's more of just a fact of modern life.
I want to bring up one more thing that's been lingering in my brain for a long time, and I feel like I haven't had any sparring partner to talk about this. And so let's just go into it, because YouTube turned 20 years old last year. It has
Mhm.
matured as a platform. And I see so many similarities to the days of MTV, where MTV was really shaping culture and was built on independent artists and, showcasing music. And after their 20th anniversary, there was a massive decline in its relevance.
Mhm.
A, because of a shift in content strategy, because they prioritized reality TV over music. But that was also driven by a technological shift, with the internet and with music pirating and new platforms like YouTube being available to just watch your favorite music video whenever, right? You were not dependent on linear television. So the question that's been in my mind since last year is, have we reached peak YouTube? Have we reached peak creator economy? Are we like on the downslope, or are we just like on a little flat patch and like about to go through the roof?
I think that one, yes and no. I think that yes, we've reached the peak in that I think you're talking about a certain type of more indie, anybody can make it sort of YouTube. I
Mm-hmm.
don't think we've reached the peak of YouTube as a platform. I think that YouTube is infrastructure in a way that MTV was not. MTV is a channel. YouTube is infrastructure that contains millions of channels, right? That can all
Mm-hmm.
be on the scale, not all of them, but that many of which can be on the scale of an MTV. Um, YouTube is increasingly going to be more popular, more viewed. It's going to be only more important infrastructure. But the type of YouTube you're talking about, of like there being less big channels, it being more monocultural, yes, we've reached the peak of that, but we haven't reached the peak of YouTube viewership, of new channels being made on YouTube and money being put into them to become these super high attention grabbing channels. We've not reached the peak of that. YouTube is not dying as a platform, but I think that you're referring to a sort of indie maker, indie creator culture that we have reached the peak of. This world is professionalizing and more money is coming into it and sharper strategies. And it is going to be harder to compete as a small independent maker.
Damn, that is a judgment. Um, but I really appreciate you giving me that perspective, because it is kind of summarizing how the shift I've been seeing. There was this promise, never spoken out loud, but like YouTube's slogan was broadcast yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
And with that came the promise of like anybody can make it, which is still technically true,
Mm-hmm.
but it is becoming harder and harder. And just getting lucky is not enough anymore. That is kind of the starting point. If you got lucky, you then can build a business on top of that. But not everybody gets to that point where this makes sense. Or
Anybody can win the lottery, but it's not really.
yes, and like no, the nuance is like again the business angle. Like you can be a very successful, you can have a very successful YouTube channel with 50 views on each video, right? The math works out. If you have a good converting video with a good product in the background, 50 views is plenty, right? But that isn't the promise of becoming a YouTuber. That's a different kind of, you're just using it as infrastructure.
I almost brought this up earlier too,
Yeah.
where this idea that like in the creator economy, anyone can make it, like that's a very American thing that's been exported on the internet, right? And YouTube being this American platform.
America's great at exporting culture.
Exactly. And great at exporting this American dream and imposing it on other people, which I don't necessarily think is healthy, right? This is maybe opening up too much of a can of worms too late in the episode. But you know, you said at the very beginning, you referenced this, what I've talked to you about, how like I'm interested in the creator as this digital workforce.
Yeah.
And part of the creator as a digital workforce is that all creators are inherently in competition with all other creators, right? There's collaborations and such, but on any of these platforms, you are competing for the same eyeballs as everybody else broadly, right? Like all of which to say, the creator economy is set up in this individualistic, you know, massive marketplace. We're all competing for limited resources manner. And that is this very American export to the world. And this, you know, if you're going to do it for fun and you're doing it for the creative satisfaction and you are making money other ways, that's great. But if you're not, you got to be a bit ruthless.
I'm tempted to let this just be the end of the thing. But this concept of creators being in competition with each other, when I started to get into it, you know, 2021, 2022, it didn't feel that way. It felt like a rising tide lifts all boats.
Which is also true. But
there was space to grow for everybody. And now there's a billion ships in one port and everybody's trying to get people on board. And now it does feel like whatever you publish is in competition with your best friends, with completely unrelated content, with slop content, and with people disengaging from consuming media in general, be that by going offline or by just synthesizing material through their LLM and not consuming it actively.
Hey, wait, I have an optimistic take as well, though, which is, yes, there's so much more competition than ever, and it's only going to increase, but not all these creators and companies are going to continue doing it, right? There's this classic, I don't know if, like who said this, and probably multiple people, but there's this classic sort of line of like, you know, the musicians or artists who make it are the ones who just don't stop. And, you know, 30 years in, most of the other people stopped, right? And that can be hard. This is where the romance does come back into it, right? To do it for a really extended amount of time and to have that endurance, you do need that romance and discipline in equal measure. You need to really care about what you're doing and why you're doing it and the craft of it beyond the business side of it. So like in some ways, arguably, that romance does need to come first, right? That just love of doing the thing. Because other people, other companies, creators who lack that won't necessarily stick around for the long run. So that's my optimistic take, is like quality and care for the craft and care for the work wins out in the long run, but it also needs some of that business acumen and strategy.
Yeah, I think that is something we agree on. And I think a great closing note is really, when we break it down, the difference between the successful creators and the people that disappear is the successful ones just keep going.
Yeah,
they stay
and
in
keep
the
reinventing
game.
themselves, as you said.
Yeah,
they keep adjusting and pivoting and like trying the new platform to take advantage of new platforms and etc.
And so over a long period of time, they are able to maintain their passion, their interest, whatever drives them, and also the financial aspect of it. Because one without the other is what kills a channel. And as always, there's an extended version of this conversation over on the Patreon, the Creator Trust Club. There we get into the question if content needs critics. But if you're ready to build a business like a creator, check out the Orbit newsletter. where I share insights from the creator economy, traditional media, and business fundamentals so you can become a successful creator. I hope to see you there.